Arrival Pier 90, and the first glimpse of a war machine. October 3, 1944, Pier 90, Hoboken, New Jersey. The ship's gangway groaned like an old hinge as it lowered, and the October air bit with a wet salt that smelled of tar, diesel, and cold iron. A line of men moved down that ramp as if they had been cut from the same cloth of fatigue and disbelief. German soldiers in faded Feldgrau wool tunics, some with the silver braid of NCOs on their collars, others with the ragged edges of conscripts. At the head of the column stood Feldwebel Hans Müller, 42, a broad-shouldered veteran of the Eastern Front whose right sleeve still bore a faint smear of frozen mud from a winter months before. Beside him, Unteroffizier Karl Beck, 27, fingerless gloves stuffed into his puttees, kept his gaze low. Their hands were cuffed with dull chain links. Small metal tags hung from their collars, stamped POW, United States Army. You feel in the way a camera would the shallow focus of the moment, the scrape of boots on steel, the rattle of chains, the distant clank and whisper of machinery. An American Guard Staff Sergeant James O'Connell barked a routine that had become almost ceremonial. Right face, single file, keep moving. His M1 carbine hung at his hip. His uniform was clean, the brass on his cap polished to a functional shine. Behind him, a row of MPs in M1943 uniforms formed a human fence, helmets tilted as if to shield their eyes from the morning glare. They were professional, efficient, part of the same machine that had brought these men across an ocean. Beyond the pier, the scene opened like a set piece. Across the Hudson, the monstrous silhouette of the Bethlehem shipyards and the sprawling complexes of the New Jersey Industrial Corridor rose in tiered blocks of brick, steel, and glass. High chimneys belched steady plumes of smoke that rolled and merged into the low clouds. Cranes stood like skeletal giants, booms tilted with contraband grace. The air vibrated with the constant percussion of production, distant hammers, pneumatic drills, the measured thud of riveters. Trucks idled in lines, their headlights glinting glass-bead bright. A convoy of olive-drab transporters painted with white stars rolled past, each vehicle a small emblem of a nation's output. For men whose recent history had been trenches, retreat lines, and rationed expectations, this was a landscape that did not reconcile with the maps in their heads. Muller's eyes narrowed. He pressed his lips into a thin line and inhaled deeper than was necessary, as if scent could translate what his eyes refused to accept. Beside him, Beck's jaw worked. He glanced at the others. There was talk of low German murmurs that the Americans had told them nothing of that which lay inland. The truth, however, met them long before any American explained it, a gigantic, humming confidence in brick and steel. A young American dock foreman stepped forward, clipboard in hand. He wore grease on his palms and a cap tilted at a rakish angle. He was more curious than hostile. "Name?" he asked, and a translator repeated the question. Names were taken, ranks recorded on forms stamped with the U.S. War Department seal. The process was clinical, almost bureaucratic in its calm. A camera clicked somewhere to the left, an embankment photographer from a U.S. newsreel company, perhaps indifferent to individual stories, intent on capturing the collective truth of production and victory. The POWs were herded past towering crates stenciled with words that meant more than freight. Aircraft PARTS, fragile, MUNITIONS, handle with care, B-17 fuselage section. A convoy of jeeps and half-tracks full of civilian workers in overalls and headscarves flowed past them, faces streaked with oil and sweat, cigarettes dangling, laughter like steam escaping. Women, riveters, and welders who had learned to move with the patient fury of those who make things, carried torches and electric drills. Their hands were steady and quick, and when one paused and met the eyes of a German sentry, there was no malice in her glance, only a rough curiosity and the unadorned pride of a society turned to purpose. The scale of the factories called to mind engines rather than buildings. One could see assembly lines that looked like rivers frozen in motion, conveyors swallowing parts and returning finished metal. On the far side of the shipyard, The frame of a B-24 Liberator lay on its belly like a beached whale, its skeletal ribs exposed to the sky. Men in coveralls moved along its spine with practiced choreography, a language of clicks and measured gestures learned in weeks that had to serve for years. Sparks flew like distant constellations where welders met metal. The light, high, sharp, unfiltered by color, rendered every surface in hard relief. The gleam of a wrench, the sheen on a worker's forehead, the coarse weave of a German tunic. Muller's mouth formed a soundless exhale that the recorder would later call the moment of comprehension. He had known, in an abstract way, of America's capacity. He had read intercepted intelligence, the propaganda, the maps. But maps do not have sound. Maps do not have the weight of smoke nor the scale of a stack of fuselages taller than a church. Here, production was no longer a statistical war chart. It was a present, roaring, making machine. The POWs' reactions were not uniform. Some, like Beck, stared with an open-faced astonishment that bordered on disbelief. Others, older and more world-weary, seemed to adopt a defensive stillness, as if withdrawing into the discipline that had sustained them through frost and retreat. Yet all shared a private count of inventory in their heads. Machines, materials, manpower, the arithmetic of industry that, they understood instinctively, would eventually be translated into steel wings and rolling tracks and the thunder of overmatching force. An American officer, Captain Richard L. Stanton, 2nd Battalion, 114th Infantry, stepped up, his voice practiced in the tones of both authority and reassurance. He spoke to the translator and then to the POWs in halting German, offering the briefest of statements: accommodations, rations, transport to camps inland. There was procedural kindness in his words, but the landscape itself spoke a sterner message. This nation could make, indefinitely, and that capacity tilted the future. As the column moved away from the pier and into the maw of crates and cranes, you could still hear the ship's horn bellowing low behind them, a sound like a punctuation mark to their passage. The camera would later freeze this sequence in grainy black and white. Men in chains framed by smoke and sinew, the curvature of a fuselage in the background, a woman riveter caught mid-swing with sparks spraying like silver rain. But in the moment itself, before any frame could capture meaning, the POWs carried a private tumult. The slow dawning that the battlefield they had known was not the whole of it. That battle could be made, in time and in quantities, on factory floors, in assembly lines, in the patient violence of industrial rhythm. The long ride west, through the heart of America's arsenal. The train that carried them away from the coast was long enough to vanish at both horizons. Olive-drab troop cars, their sides scabbed with coal dust and stenciled U.S. Army transport, rattled across the rails with a rhythm that felt endless, metal on metal, a steady clatter that dissolved thought. It was October 6, 1944. The German prisoners, 200 men divided among 8 cars, were bound for Camp Concordia, Kansas, a place none of them had heard of, a dot on a map in the American plains. Feldwebel Hans Muller sat by the narrow window, watching the world unfold in mechanical precision. Each passing hour revealed something new, not ruins or famine, but abundance. Outside the glass, the landscape was stitched with factories, rail yards, bridges, and towns that pulsed with activity. At every junction, freight cars waited, flatbeds stacked with aircraft wings, tanks under tarps, crates labeled Ordnance Department. Even the smallest stations seemed alive with the same electric current. Men in overalls waving signals, switchmen working in teams, locomotives breathing plumes of steam into a wide, uncaring sky. Muller turned to his seatmate Carl Beck. "Siehst du das? Do you see that?" he muttered, his voice more breath than speech. Beck nodded, eyes reflecting the blur of movement. "It doesn't end," he said quietly in German. "There's no end to it." 2 cars down, an American guard with a Kansas accent, Private First Class Henry Lewis, leaned against the bulkhead, smoking, his carbine slung loose. "You boys ever see the Ford plant?" he asked the corporal beside him. "They say it spits out bombers like hotcakes. one every 55 minutes. The other soldier chuckled. Yeah, and I hear the Krauts thought we couldn't fight without English tea. The train roared into another industrial valley, Pittsburgh perhaps, or Cleveland. Overhead, bridges stacked on bridges. Below, rivers full of barges gliding past mills. The POWs craned their necks to see the factories glowing orange from within, furnaces illuminating the night sky as if the cities themselves were on fire. But these fires did not consume, they created. Molten metal poured into molds, hammer presses struck rhythmically, conveyor belts snaked through open doors, carrying the bones of airplanes and tanks. To a German soldier, these scenes were unthinkable. The Reich had its own factories, of course, great foundries in the Ruhr, assembly halls in Bremen, but those had been pounded into silence by Allied bombs. Here, there were no ruins. Every building stood intact, every machine in motion. Even at midnight, workers moved in shifts, floodlights glaring against the dark, their shadows long and tireless. As the train passed a massive rail yard near Chicago, Mueller caught a glimpse that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Hundreds of locomotives idling side by side, smoke curling from their stacks like a choir of giants breathing in unison. Rows of boxcars stretched beyond sight, painted with stenciled codes, not chaos, but order made visible. America, he realized, did not just have machines. It was a machine, a nation engine that never stopped. Inside the car, conversation faded into quiet astonishment. Some of the younger POWs, boys who had last seen their homeland through the smoke of retreat, stared with something like envy. Others folded their arms and muttered bitterly about propaganda, about appearances. But even they fell silent when the next dawn came, and the train rolled through endless farmland, not barren, but cultivated and thriving. Every field was full of tractors, every barn roof painted with "Buy war bonds." They stopped briefly in St. Louis for fuel. Through the slatted windows, Mueller saw children waving American flags and a group of factory workers eating sandwiches beside the track. No rubble, no ration lines. Just the ordinary hum of people at peace within a war. An American sergeant offered the POWs coffee in tin cups, strong, black, unmeasured. Mueller hesitated before accepting, then nodded a wordless thanks. The man smiled, half out of kindness, half out of curiosity. "Wait till you see Kansas," he said. "Nothing out there but sky and wheat." Hours later, when the factories gave way to plains, the prisoners began to talk among themselves. One man, a former engineer from Hamburg, tried to calculate aloud how many tons of steel the Americans must produce in a single day. Another speculated that these sights were staged, meant to demoralize them. Mueller said nothing. He only kept watching the horizon, the endless line where land met sky, and thought of how Germany had once boasted of total war. This quiet, efficient vastness was what total war truly looked like. By the third day, the train had crossed Missouri and entered Kansas. The light had changed. The air grew dry and pale. Through the dusty windows, they could see another kind of industry: grain elevators, rail depots, machine shops tucked beside wind-blown fields. Even here, hundreds of miles from the coasts, the rhythm of production continued. Tractors clattered, combines rolled, and new barns rose beside old ones. There was no front line, no visible fear. Only motion, organized, constant, unstoppable. When they finally reached the camp, the sun was low. Camp Concordia was ringed with barbed wire and guard towers, but it was not what they expected. Inside the fences stood wooden barracks, clean and freshly painted, a mess hall, workshops, and open fields. American guards greeted them with polite detachment, not hatred. Some even spoke a few words of German. Mueller stepped off the train and inhaled deeply. The air was warm with dust and wheat. Beyond the fence, the horizon stretched wide and silent, and somewhere in that silence, the hum of distant engines still echoed in his ears. For the first time since leaving Europe, he felt small, not defeated by soldiers, but by scale itself. The factories behind the fences, work, wonder, and the realization. October 18, 1944, Camp Concordia, Kansas. The mornings began with the clang of a bell and the distant rumble of trains passing beyond the horizon. Frost clung to the barracks windows, and the air smelled faintly of wheat chaff and machine oil, a strange marriage of field and factory. The German POWs rose in practiced unison, a habit drilled into them long before captivity. They folded blankets, polished boots, and lined up for inspection. But what awaited them beyond the gates was nothing like the Europe they had left behind. After breakfast, squads of prisoners were assigned to local labor details. American trucks carried them, under guard but not mistreated, to nearby factories, rail yards, and farms. Some repaired machinery, others sorted lumber or worked in warehouses that supplied the war effort. Feldwebel Hans Müller was assigned to the Midwestern Equipment Plant No. 12, a vast complex of corrugated steel buildings on the outskirts of Salina. Inside, the rhythmic pounding of presses and the hiss of steam filled every corner. To Müller, it was like stepping into the lungs of a living organism. Conveyor belts hummed, forklifts whined, and overhead cranes glided like metallic birds, lifting and lowering heavy loads with effortless grace. Hundreds of American workers, men and women both, moved with mechanical precision. Their coveralls bore embroidered patches. War Department, Boeing subcontractor, U.S. Army Ordnance. They worked without shouting, without the barked orders he was used to. The sound was not chaos, it was harmony. Private First Class Henry Lewis, the same guard from the train, oversaw the POW detail that day. He gestured toward a group of welders. "You fellas ever see one of these before?" he asked, tapping the side of a half-built engine block. "We're turning these out for Sherman tanks. Every day, 10 of them roll off the line." Müller ran a hand across the cool, unfinished metal. He didn't answer. In Germany, such engines would have required weeks waiting for parts, dealing with shortages, watching as Allied bombers reduced progress to rubble. Here, everything was in motion, uninterrupted. The American foreman, a wiry man named Tom Riley, handed Müller a wrench. "If you know machines," Riley said, "you'll fit right in. We don't waste hands here." As the day went on, Müller watched the system unfold from raw steel to finished engine. He marveled at the simplicity of the tools, the abundance of materials, and above all, the discipline of the workers. At lunch, the Americans shared bread and coffee. A woman named Clara, her hair tied back in a red kerchief, smiled and offered him a cigarette. "You boys built those Messerschmitts, right?" she asked casually. Müller nodded, uncertain whether to feel pride or shame. Clara shrugged. "Well, now you're helping us build the machines that'll finish the war faster. Ain't that something?" Her tone wasn't cruel. It was simply pragmatic, the voice of a nation that believed production was the truest form of power. By November, many of the POWs had found a strange rhythm to their captivity. They worked by day, slept by night, and sent a portion of their pay, a few cents an hour, to the camp canteen in exchange for soap, tobacco, or letters home. But what changed most was not their routine. It was their perception. Beck, the young Unteroffizier, spent his days repairing tractors for the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps. He began to notice small details, the quality of American steel, the uniformity of parts, the efficiency of supply lines. "In Germany," he told Müller one evening in the barracks, "we had engineers. Here, they have systems." He was right. America's secret weapon was not a single invention. Not the B-29, not the Sherman, not the Liberty ship. It was the vast machinery of organization itself. Every bolt, every plank, every wheel had a place and a schedule. And everyone, from the riveter to the farmer, seemed to know their part in the choreography. On Sundays, the POWs were allowed brief recreation, soccer in a fenced yard, sometimes a trip to the camp library. There Müller discovered magazines, Life, Popular Mechanics, Collier's Weekly. The glossy pages were filled with photographs of assembly lines, steelworks, and women smiling beside bomber wings. He studied them the way a soldier studies reconnaissance photos, with equal parts fascination and disbelief. One image, captioned "America's Arsenal at Work," showed a factory floor with 1,000 workers assembling aircraft engines. The photograph was so vast that he couldn't see where the line ended. He traced the caption with his finger. "This," he whispered, "is how they fight." When Christmas came, the local church sent gifts, socks, candy, and postcards. American guards decorated the mess hall with paper stars and red ribbons. Someone set up a gramophone and played Bing Crosby's "I'll Be Home for Christmas." The melody hung in the cold air like memory itself. Mueller sat at a wooden table, staring at his hands, calloused from work that wasn't war. He thought of the Reich's promises of total victory, of destiny. And he thought of the humming factories that lay beyond the fences, unbombed, unstoppable, infinite. In his notebook that night, he wrote a single line in careful script. "We did not lose to their soldiers, we lost to their factories." He would never say it aloud, but the truth had already settled among the men. The shock had given way to understanding, a recognition that America's might was not a boast or illusion, but a reality built in steel, sweat, and time. And though they were prisoners, they were witnessing the future, one rivet, one engine, one heartbeat of industry at a time. The turning point, lessons in captivity and the birth of respect. January 1945. The Kansas wind cut across the plains like a blade of glass, cold and endless. The war in Europe was still raging, but here, in the heart of America, the German prisoners lived in a world that felt impossibly distant from the front. At Camp Concordia, the rhythm of the days had settled into something between labor and reflection. Each morning, the POWs stood in formation beneath the watchtowers, breath fogging in the frigid dawn. Yet the guards no longer watched them with suspicion, more with habit. Discipline remained, but hostility had faded. The Americans saw not enemies, but workers. The Germans saw not captors, but people whose world had functioned even under the strain of total war. Mueller and Beck were now trusted with supervising other POW laborers at the Salina equipment plant. The Americans had come to rely on their mechanical expertise. Sometimes, the foreman even asked their advice. It was a strange inversion of roles, the prisoners, teaching the victors how to repair a machine faster, more efficiently. One day, as Mueller tightened bolts along the frame of a tractor chassis, Tom Riley, the foreman, leaned beside him. "Heard from the papers that your folks tried some counteroffensive back in Belgium," Riley said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Big push, Ardennes, they call it." Mueller nodded slowly. "Yes," he said in halting English, "maybe the last one." Riley didn't reply immediately. He just looked out across the floor where dozens of American workers and POWs labored side by side, sparks flying like fireflies. "You know," he said at last, "you boys fight hard. But I gotta tell you this right here." He gestured to the factory, to the belts, the cranes, the endless movement. "This is how we're gonna win." Mueller said nothing. He didn't need to. The proof surrounded him. When spring came, the POWs began work on the Kansas wheat harvest. For the first time, they were out in open fields, under skis so wide it felt as though the earth itself had no edges. There were no fences here, only distance and trust. American farmers, short on labor because of the war, welcomed them cautiously. But soon, necessity gave way to friendship. Mueller worked for a farmer named William "Bill" Harper, an old man with sun-browned skin and a laugh like gravel. Harper treated him like a hired hand, not a prisoner. "We got more in common than you think," Harper would say. "Both of us work the land, both pray for rain, both got sons in this damn war." It was true. Mueller's son was fighting on the Eastern Front. Harper's son was in France. Neither man knew if their boys were still alive. In that shared uncertainty, they found an unspoken bond. On Sundays, Harper's wife would bring lemonade and biscuits to the field. Mueller was invited to sit on the porch, though a guard always stayed nearby. Still, for a man who had spent years in mud and fire, it felt like civilization again. He noticed things, small things, that spoke of America's character. The tractor that Harper used was a 1942 John Deere Model D. It had been running almost nonstop for 3 years, yet its engine purred without fail. Spare parts were easy to find, tools plentiful, fuel abundant. Nothing was rationed, nothing improvised. Even the wheat sacks bore the same printed logos, uniform and clean. In Germany, such consistency would have been impossible by 1945. Beck, working on a neighboring farm, had similar experiences. He wrote in his diary, "Here the war feels like a rumor. Their factories feed their fields feed their soldiers. Every wheel turns for the same purpose. We had brilliance, they have organization." As news from Europe trickled in, the collapse of the German lines, the fall of the Rhine, and finally the death of Hitler, the camp grew quiet. Some POWs wept, others stared blankly at the dusty horizon. Müller simply sat by the fence, watching the sunset turn the wheat gold. He felt neither victory nor defeat, only a vast fatigue. Captain Stanton, the camp commander, approached him that evening. "It's over," he said gently. "Your country's surrendered." Müller nodded. "Yes," he replied softly, "but it ended long before today." Stanton looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" Müller met his eyes. "The day we saw your factories," he said, "that was the day Germany lost." The weeks that followed were filled with uncertain peace. The POWs were told they would be repatriated soon, though no one knew when. The Americans treated them fairly, even kindly. The local townsfolk, once wary, began inviting them to church picnics, to community baseball games. Some of the prisoners painted murals on the camp's dining hall, wheat fields, rivers, even portraits of the B-17 bombers they had once tried to shoot down. When the day of departure finally came, the same train that had brought them rolled in once more. This time it was spring, the fields outside green and alive. The men carried small bags and letters from the Americans who had come to know them. Clara, the factory worker, handed Müller a folded newspaper clipping, a photo of the factory floor where they had first met. "Souvenir," she said, "so you don't forget what you saw here." He smiled faintly. "I will not forget," he said. "None of us will." As the train began to move, Müller looked out through the barred window. The smokestacks in the distance were still working, still breathing, still alive. The machine had not stopped for war, nor for peace. And he realized then that America's greatest weapon had never been its bombs or its tanks, it was its people, and their faith in the power of creation itself. He turned to Beck and said quietly, "Perhaps one day Germany will learn this lesson, to build, not destroy." The train's whistle echoed across the plains, a long, low sound that marked not just the end of captivity, but the beginning of understanding.